Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction, and so lovely to see so many of you here online today. I'd also just like to thank you for joining me, and also to the HES team for inviting me to speak with you here today, and also for organizing these great series of talks that take place over the year. And I would also just like to give a special thank you to RSAI past president, Aideen Ireland, whose knowledge of the Society's history and collections has been really invaluably helpful for this research. But considering that this talk will be discussing a past society excursion, I thought it would be important, but also a bit of fun, to preface how this subject presented itself through organizing an excursion with the RSAI to Edinburgh in partnership with the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland last June in 2024. So, before our travels to Edinburgh, I'd actually been organizing materials in the RSAI archive and came across this very stunning illustrated guide for the Society's 1899 excursion to the Western and Northern Islands off the coast of Scotland. Upon opening the volume, I was instantly intrigued by the frontispiece photograph of the steamship Magic, and subsequently amused as the first-class ship was privately chartered by the Society for the greater comfort of the party on their travels, which was really a most different change of circumstances considering the legroom on our flight over to Edinburgh on the way to Dublin. But despite these slight differences, the 2024 excursion to Edinburgh was still very much like the 1899 Scottish Archaeological tour in spirit, as it provided opportunities for future collaborations and fellow antiquarians to meet, in addition for the ability to speak with experts and colleagues at sites, monuments, and institutions such as the archive at Historic Environment Scotland, which really helps build better connections and create better understandings between people and places as we go and travel on these types of excursions and our own personal travels as well. So the talk today will build upon the familiarity of such types of travel experiences to reconsider the cultural and historical significance of the 1899 Scottish Archaeological Tour and how archival materials and online collection resources can provide, prompt, and enrich fascinating new avenues of research and discovery. Photographs from the collections and online resources of Historic Environment Scotland will complement this guided tour, so to speak, of the ephemera, photos, and journal entries of the 1899 Scottish tour held in the RSA archives to re-experience what was contemporaneously described as a real Celtic reunion. Beginning with a short history of the RSAI sea cruises in the 1890s and their established reputation in Ireland for conservation work by the period into the 19th century. The talk will then follow the route of the 1899 tour from Sanda to Orkney Islands and then back to Belfast, with supporting material from the 1899 illustrated guide and personal accounts from the Irish antiquarian and photographer Jane Shackleton and her photographs of the excursion. Furthermore, as one of 34 women who attended the Scottish tour, a noteworthy number considering the time period, Shackleton's musings and astute observations of the sites which she presented to the Society in November 1899, along with her documentary images, can provide unique insights into women's participation and contributions to archaeological research in the late 19th century. Similarly, as the 1899 Scottish tour was widely advertised or reported by Irish and Scottish newspapers, it deserves further study as its significance in late 19th century culture can be easily measured in this capacity. Early advertisements for the tour, in addition to illustrations and frequent updates from, quote, mystery correspondents on board the SS Magic via telegraph or telephone at accessible locations, highlight not only the historical importance of the voyage as the first of its kind, but also the shared sociocultural interest in understanding the evolution and origins of Celtic art. As an art historian with a particular interest in visual material culture, the archival materials associated with this early antiquarian voyage and Celtic gathering were absolutely fascinating in their diverse details and depictions of sites and monuments. However, and perhaps more importantly, the following ephemera, photographs, and manuscripts to be discussed can demonstrate how broader interdisciplinary research can strongly support new approaches and readings of understudied or overlooked materials and archives, such as the 1899 illustrated guidebook and other objects in institutional collections. Likewise, as the guidebook was gifted to special guests along the voyage and its contents were reprinted, albeit without the same level of decorative details, in the Society's journal in volumes 3 and 4. This archaeological tour was to encourage further discussion and comparative analysis between artistic and ecclesiastic development at Celtic sites. By reconsidering the following materials held in the collections of Historic Environment Scotland and the RSAI as a type of collective memory, this talk seeks to overall enrich the ways in which we continue to research, document, and engage with historical sites and archives through this virtual visit back in time along the northern and western islands of Scotland aboard the SS Magic in 1899. In fact, the 1899 Scottish Archaeological Tour was the first biennial sea cruise chartered from the Belfast Steamship Company by the RSAI for its annual program of events, following 2 tours on the SS Caloric, which circumnavigated Ireland along the Antrim coastline to Galway Bay in 1895, and continued from Galway Bay to the Skellig Islands off the coast of County Kerry in 1897. These 2 tours in 1895 and 97 provided members with the opportunities to view what was contemporaneously described by newspapers as, quote, unique monuments of prehistoric times and monuments of the rarest type dating from the 7th century. Likewise, these cruises in Ireland were recognized for their ability to open up new fields of investigation of antiquaries and monuments at sites along the coast and islands that were described as heretofore almost inaccessible and could not be conveniently approached otherwise. These explorative excursions, which provided foundational archaeological research at sites in Ireland, were subsequently reflected in scholarships, illustrations, and photographs, which were then published in the Society's journal and distributed worldwide. However, the research and tours carried out by the Society in Ireland throughout the 1880s and 90s were also popularly regarded by the Irish press as crucial to informing the touristic development of the country, even more so than Ireland's Tourist Association. Especially as by 1894, the Society, which was established in Kilkenny in 1849 to preserve, examine, and illustrate all ancient monuments and memorials and the arts, manners, and customs of the past, as connected with the antiquities, languages, and literature of Ireland, had famously restored Kilkenny's Franciscan Tower, various monuments at Clonmacnoise, the Round Tower of Monaster Boyce, Jerpoint Abbey, the 7 churches of Glendalough, among other sites of historical and cultural interest, through their, quote, intelligently directed excursions and excavations held throughout the country. These early Society excursions and excavations were particularly important to the development of scholarship on Irish antiquarian subjects during the period, and also for establishing a museum of national importance in Kilkenny, but additionally in their ability to foster connections with men and women of local communities and the gentry, which led to the establishment of other local societies which were based on the RSAI's model of preservation. Following the Society's relocation to Dublin from Kilkenny in the 1890s, they saw their membership increase by 3-fold to 1,370 members in 1898. And by the time of their voyage to Scotland in 1899, the RSAI was contemporaneously recognized in publications as not only the strongest and most prosperous society in Great Britain and Ireland, but also the largest in the region and world, with members in continental Europe, America, and Australia. It was with the support of the RSAI's extensive membership and their social networks that the SS Magic, an express 220-person first-class passenger steamship, could be chartered from Belfast with only 130 persons for their 8 days to the north and western islands of Scotland in 1899, as the number was the largest party which could be landed on boats or managed on shore, but perhaps more importantly, for the greater comfort of the party and also to avoid crowding. Building upon their previous experience on the SS Caloric in Ireland in 1895 and 97, which RSAI Honorable General Secretary Robert Cochrane noted brought, quote, so much satisfaction to the archaeologists who took part in them, a Scottish excursion was planned for a contemporary study of Celtic art, archaeology, and ecclesiology. As a lengthier trip was to be undertaken than in previous years, it was suggested to charter the Magic instead of the 80-passenger caloric, not only just for comfort, but also for increased numbers to allow fellow antiquarians and archaeologists of other societies to join and, quote, take part in the proceedings. Indeed, some of the earliest and most enthusiastic supporters of the 1899 Scottish excursion were fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, such as Dr. Joseph Anderson, keeper of the National Museum of Antiquaries of Scotland and Assistant Secretary of the Society, who assisted in preparing the published program for the excursion and provided extensive advice for numerous sites. Archaeologist Dr. Robert Monroe, Honorary Secretary of the Society, who also kindly suggested numerous sites, and Mr. James Currister, a collector and antiquarian who was kindly described by RSAI Onginsec Robert Cochrane as a guide, philosopher, and friend to the party on Orkney and in Caithness. With the early support from numerous Scottish fellows, and considering that some would be joining parts of the excursion in Scotland locally, it was decided to then invite members of the Cambrian Archaeological Association to join the RSAI on the SS Magic in Belfast to enlarge the archaeological field among kindred Celtic associations. Being the first described Celtic gathering, with the exception of the Bretons, archaeologists and antiquarians representing the Scots, Welsh, Manx, Cornish, and Irish Gaels, in addition to representatives of the Pan-Celtic Council and Gaelic League, intentionally sailed together to further understand what 19th century Irish archaeologists recognized as a so-called characteristic postscript in the development of Celtic art and culture. The Western Highlands of Scotland and Hebrides were of particular interest, as they expected to find particular developments of the art of ancient Erin and comparative sites and objects which would reflect and enrich understandings of how cultural individuality naturally became absorbed and transformed by the changing fashions of the medieval epochs and by political and social environments. While distinctively Irish in its focus, the trip was also to benefit all Gaels in attendance, as it would further their understanding of cross-cultural exchanges and archaeological sites throughout the broader region. This shared spirit of camaraderie and cultural connections can be partially and visually understood in the printed list of Gaelic words and sailing directions on the west coast of Scotland, which included a pronunciation key and English translations, in addition to a comprehensive bibliography that was collectively compiled by members and fellows of the RSAI, the Cambrian Archaeological Society, and fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Likewise, attendees from different societies would have been well aware that there was a lack of research on the subject of comparative developments in Celtic art between Ireland and Scotland, due to the early works of RSAI Vice President Bishop William Reeves, who unfortunately had passed away in 1892 before the voyage, but whose knowledge of Scots Celtic art and ecclesiology was attributed with shaping the foundational framework for the sites and scholarly spirit of the tour. It was, in fact, Reeves's archaeological publications that Cochrane credited in the 1899 guidebook with providing the excursion's attendees with, quote, great certainty as to what is in store for those who join this most interesting tour. The trip's itinerary was methodically planned for over a year, with significant contributions to the program made by members of the RSAI and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. However, without the connections and contributions of the Honourable Secretary for the Ulster Society of Antiquaries, Mr. Seton Milligan, it is not likely that an extensive nor luxurious voyage could have been undertaken, as he is solely credited in the RSAI's illustrated program and additionally in Irish newspapers, and being indefatigable in his exertions in carrying out arrangements with the Belfast Steamship Company in the most important duty of financing the scheme. Payment for the excursion was to cost £10 each for attendees, with the equivalent of that being roughly £1,050 in today's spending power. when that included the elaborately illustrated guidebook, which was published by the University Press at Trinity College Dublin, saloon class rail to return tickets to attendees' respective countries, 2 days of additional events in Ulster, as well as the 8 days room and board and 4 daily meals of first-class cuisine of breakfast, lunch, and dinner and tea aboard the Magic, which of course notably excluded the wine. Similarly, attendees were well notified in advance to bring a comfortable amount of cash to have on hand, as they would be responsible for paying the steward's fees, the boatman for landing, tolls and landing dues were applicable, and for vehicles on their landing at Stromness. The ship is proudly noted in the guidebook as being built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast in 1893, the same who later built the Titanic. And it was described as being fitted up with large, well-ventilated staterooms, a dining saloon, smoke room, promenade deck, ladies and gentlemen's bathrooms, and electric light throughout. Likewise, special accommodations were also provided for attendees who were arriving from Liverpool, so that their steamer, the Indefatigable, could conveniently arrive directly next to the Magic an hour before the excursion's departure at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, 20th of June from Donegal Quay. This placement of the two steamships was not only useful for attendees, but also for a crew of 5 young boys from the ship from Liverpool, who joined to assist for the voyage on the Magic before returning with members of the Cambrian Archaeological Society at the end of the tour. However, their time aboard was not always all work, as they frequently accompanied the group to sites, sang and danced among attendees in the evenings, and were described as causing, quote, a mild sensation among the girls of Kirkwell and Orkney, who presented them with flowers. The fixed price of £10 also determined the 8-day time frame on the ship, which Cochrane noted took into account the views of about a score of representative archaeologists and a very general wish to limit the period to 8 days at sea. While the program may seem moderately ambitious, and that's even by modern standards, due to inclement weather and the like, nothing on the excursion was omitted. And that is likely because the weather remained pleasant after their first afternoon on Sanda Island. The excursion's photographer Jane Shackleton described how the program, which Cochrane emphasized had no time for dawdling, was always well up to time, but sometimes at the expense of very hurried visits to the places of interest. However, while the first half of the tour was considerably more crowded, in Cochrane's words, the final days of the voyage were to be more leisurely, with additional time to visit sites and meet with local Scottish fellows like Mr. James Currister on Orkney. The excitement of the first few days' events was also reflected in the excursion's departure from Donegal Quay, with newspapers noting the crowds on the day and Jane Shackleton's delightful recollections of seeing some 50 members of the Cambrian Archaeological Association and a great many of those from Dublin boarding the Magic on the morning, as she had arrived to stay on the ship the evening before due to fearing dubious weather on her travels north to Belfast from Lucan, County Dublin. Shackleton's fears were not completely unfounded, as rain had begun to fall in Belfast and did seem likely to continue. However, the weather did not dull her spirits for the excursion, which she described as being one of her favorite occupations, nor did it dampen her desire for the opportunity to meet up with old acquaintances and fellow travelers. The convivial atmosphere aboard the Magic, in addition to the large number of attendees, can be partially understood by Shackleton's observations before leaving Belfast, as she was so immediately delighted to know so many people, but also amusingly practiced marking off the names of passengers that she could identify upon the printed list of names in the guidebook represented here with her friends to remember new faces. Likewise, the social dynamics can be further understood in the cabin plans, stateroom, and deck assignments, which are included in an RSAI-bound volume with ephemera relating to the 1899 tour. Clearly in keeping with the period, couples were placed together, with designated roommates divided on the basis of gender, and men placed only on the lower deck. but there were clearly considerations for friends, family, and acquaintances to share spaces together, especially when comparing these documents to the list of attendees' addresses in the illustrated guidebook. Similarly, these materials reveal the diverse membership of the party and the societies represented, which the 31st of May 1899 edition of the Orkney Herald represented had 34 ladies, 15 clergymen, 20 attorneys, and 12 medical men, making this no doubt a very safe ship indeed. As weather leaving Belfast was less than favorable, the morning was spent on the way to Sanda Island off the Kintyre Peninsula, socializing and meeting others inside the Magic's comfortable saloon and smoking room. However, the showers did not last long, and the party was able to reach Sanda by 12:30 in the afternoon to investigate the ruined church of St. Ninian and crosses on the island. Upon arrival, the group disembarked from the small pier on the island and had, in the words of Jane Shackleton, a short grassy walk that brought us to the old churchyard in which stood the ruins of the chapel, dedicated to St. Ninian, one of the oldest, if not the earliest preacher of Christianity in Scotland. The church and its ruins were of particular interest to the group, as its dedication to St. Ninian had been recently challenged in ecclesiastical scholarship by the Cambridge Camden Society to suggest Irish connections and dedications to St. Columba or St. Shanahan. However, its function and meaning as an early religious site in Scotland did remain the priority. Likewise, the early Christian cross and prominently placed standing stones outside the flat-headed doorway of the northwest side of the chapel's ruins were dedicated as chief objects in the illustrated guide. The two stones, which stand at approximately 2.1 meters, are described by Shackleton as having a cross incised on its west face and the other having a cruciform stone with a raised boss on one side, which were specifically sought out by the group for their representations of Scots Celtic designs. Shackleton's photo also provides a unique glimpse into the group's activities as they examined one of the large stones here at the bottom. And it's continued to fascinate research and scholars. And although taken 126 years ago, it is still very much a common sight, as we still engage with objects, monuments, and architecture in similar ways, particularly with being able to get a close look and especially having to wait your turn in order to do so. Comparatively, the later mid-century 20th century photograph not only demonstrates the ongoing conservation and preservation of the site and its documentation, but also as well how we document our own interactions with historic sites. While this was likely taken for scale and survey purposes, it also can represent the individual's respect for the monument by not actually touching it. And I'm sure he also wouldn't be too displeased with his likeness being associated with the monuments in archival records. Furthermore, it was also at Sanda where Jane Shackleton playfully lamented her role as photographer on the excursion, and especially one with a no dawdling time frame. Upon reflecting on her time at Sanda and her photograph with the standing stone at the ruins of St. Ninian's Church, she noted that one of the difficulties a photographer has to encounter on an antiquarian excursion is evident here. It is not pleasant to be always asking people to move out of the way or to stay still for a moment when they are engaged in examining those objects that they have come so far to see. Keeping to their tight schedule, the party set out from the ruins to depart Sanda Island at 2:30 in the afternoon to anchor at Ardmore on the southeastern coast on the island of Islay, so that they could avail of the ship's boats to travel to Kildeton to view Kildeton Cross and Kildeton Church. However, upon embarking the Magic, the group was informed by the Committee of Management that the trip may possibly have to be postponed to the return voyage due to the nature of the seas. However, they did continuously and cautiously sail to Ardmore, and in doing so were treated to phenomenal views of the Mole of Kintyre, which was described as by a mystery correspondent on board for the Belfast newsletter on the 22nd of June as being, quote, a very striking picture, being right under the cliffs with brilliant green grass interspersed by the dark brown of the rocks and the great mass of the mole towering almost to the clouds. It was only when the group was sat down for dinner at 8 p.m. and begun their courses that it was announced that the ship had cast their anchor in Ardmore Bay and that the ship's boats had been let down, and they were then informed that the tour of Kildadon was about to start. Taking advantage of the midsummer sun, the ship's 3 boats set out for Kildadon. Once the boats arrived around 9 p.m., Jane Shackleton observed the decreasing daylight and feared that it would not be worthwhile taking the camera. Although thankfully for the Society archives and also for this talk, she did. She described their walk to the sites in her journal as such: being lovely through fresh green woods and observing up here and there little glades in which shaggy long-horned Highland cattle were grazing, and further on we had beautiful mountain views before the ruined church and its attendant crosses came to sight, the smaller one standing on the other side of the roadway. The group's excitement for these sites is not only represented by Shackleton's many photos, but also in the 6 pages devoted to the site in the illustrated guide, which Dr. Joseph Anderson of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland had prepared for the group's visit. However, the church and its elaborate decorative stonework of its crosses were of particular interest for the Irish archaeologist, due to some designs seemingly to have been directly derived from Ireland and comparisons made to Monaster Boyce, in addition to shared subject matter such as the representation of David rending the jaws of a lion with a sheep indicating the flock in the background, which also appears in the Book of Kells. Likewise, the crosses were regarded as having characteristics preliminary to those of Oronsay and Iona and elsewhere in the Hebrides, which could then be comparatively examined later on the tour. Considering that the group had such a late and surprise start, they unfortunately could not spend as much time exploring as they would have liked. By the time the boats left Kildadon, the last of the daylight was waning, and by the time they reached the Magic, Jane Shackleton remarked how it had become rather dark by the time they were all safely on board again. The group would remain anchored in Ardmore Bay until 5 a.m. the following morning, when they set off for Oronsay through the narrow sound of Islay, with Shackleton observing views of a distillery as they departed from the island's coastlines, and the Belfast newsletter's mystery correspondent describing its magnificent scenery from the mist. In order to arrive at Oronsay with enough time to explore the ruins and reboard the ship for 9:30 to head to other destinations, breakfast had to be served at 7:15 in the morning instead of the usual 8 a.m. Jane Shackleton notes that the change in the early hour of breakfast in her journal, but found the positives of the situations on the morning, as she stated that the breakfast on board the Magics were first come, first served, and that you could sit anywhere in the dining saloon, which was a very welcome difference between the assigned seating and divided companies at luncheon and dinner service, where attendees, in Shackleton's words, quote, had to keep the same seats which were allotted to us without any choice on our part. The main sites on Oronsay were to be the Priory and Great Cross, with the 14th century priory named as the principal object of the visit. Being an early and influential monastic settlement, and the first site that the Irish Saint Columba landed on his missionary journey, it was considered to have many objects of great interest to all archaeologists on the tour, especially as the architecture and monuments were well preserved, and the site is peculiarly arranged with the cloisters and residential buildings orientated north of the church. The preservation of the site was particularly noteworthy, as both the Belfast newsletter and Jane Shackleton give credit to the careful conservation of Sir John McNeill and his brother Malcolm McNeill, who kept respective residences on the neighboring islands of Colonsay and Oronsay, which Shackleton noted at high tide could be accessed by walking across a very narrow strait. Upon reaching Oronsay, the group met one of few inhabitants of the island, who would come to meet them by the order of Sir John McNeill to act as their guide, before they had to walk roughly a mile to the site to the priory and its high cross. Their landing was unfortunately less than pleasant, with there being a stretch of seaweed-covered rocks that Shackleton exclaimed were most difficult to walk on. However, this was soon overlooked, as she looked in the direction of the priory and saw that their way lay across grassy fields brightened by yellow pansies, marsh marigolds, and yellow gorse vines, with the latter being so in abundance that Shackleton noted how it was used in dyeing wool to support the making of homespun tweeds. While the priory was certainly named as the principal object, it could be suggested that the crosses were of more interest to the Irish members of the party, as they received additional guidance from Dr. Anderson of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to compare what RSAI Secretary Robert Cochrane described as the pure type of interlacing work, spirals, and fretwork, and other distinct characteristics of Celtic detail in the mother country and elsewhere, to the foliageous scrollwork represented on the Oronsay cross. Similarly, as there are multiple full-page illustrations of the cross in the guidebook, and almost every photo at Oronsay Jane Shackleton took features a cross, their visual significance in this context may be further measured and understood. Indeed, the rare design work and large monolithic scale of the cross, which measures approximately 3.7 meters atop a 1.2-meter pedestal, captivated earlier Scottish archaeologists and antiquarians as well, such as the unnamed gentleman seated at the pedestal and the photograph from around 1870. This photo more clearly represents the stone carvings, which the 1899 antiquarians appeared to be enraptured by in Shackleton's photo of the cross's east face. Likewise, the photos of the two gentlemen from 1870 and 1899 posing upon the pedestal can prompt further insights into the ways in which we document sites and ourselves engaging with them. The significance of the site can also be contemporaneously measured through photographic online resources as well, such as Canmore or now Trove. So if you simply search the term Oronsay, you'll see it will result in a significant number of entries for crosses at the site, and especially those of the High Cross itself being among the first listed. The following day was spent on the Isle of Skye after they traveled from sites on the Isle of Canna at 9:30 in the morning, and then anchored opposite of Dunvegan Castle, the ancestral home of the MacLeod, where Norman Angus MacLeod of MacLeod, the 26th chief of Clan MacLeod, took the party on a private tour of the estate. While this was certainly of interest to attendees, it was also of interest to local Irish and Scottish newspapers, with one clipping from an unknown Inverness publication found in the Society's bound volume with ephemera from the 1899 tour, devoting an entire section to this portion of the trip. It was reported that the MacLeod gave a most enthusiastic reception to his visitors and took them all over the place, explaining the points of interest, which was received greatly to the delight and instruction of the party. In fact, Jane Shackleton's journal further reveals the intimacy of their visit at Dunvegan, as the MacLeod met with them directly at the dock landing and briefly provided a bit of his family history and recent inheritance on Dunvegan upon the passing of his father in 1895, as he guided them to the estate. Inside, they viewed family heirlooms, such as the Dunvegan cup, a wood and silver vessel, which was discussed by Sir Walter Scott in his notes to the Lord of the Isles as being one of the greatest curiosities in Scotland. The medieval cup, which is now in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, was of particular interest to all, as its 10th century Hebridean origins have been recently disputed by Dr. Daniel Wilson in the first edition of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, 1855, following its display at the Dublin Exhibition of 1853. Wilson asserted the cup's Irish origins, and by the 1890s, the cup was understood in the guidebook and in Shackleton's journal to simply be an Irish wooden mether or drinking cup, just being more highly ornamented than usual. The MacLeod also highlighted the art collections and architectural changes and additions made by the family throughout the generations, but also manuscripts and letters by Dr. Samuel Johnson and Sir Walter Scott, which he took the time to read aloud to the group in the drawing room. One of Jane Shackleton's favorite objects of the tour was the MacLeod fairy flag, which she noted was a legendary family relic that was also too fragile to be handled due to being constructed of delicate red silk and embroidered gold. The flag was believed to be that given by the fairy wife of one of the old MacLeods, who before she disappeared gave him the cloth and told them that he or the clan were ever in danger or trouble that they could wave it and they would be helped. And it was told by the MacLeod that it was believed to have been used 3 times to save the family over the ages. The MacLeod astutely, of course, told the story in the fairy room itself, which was a secret 14th century stairway where legend stated that the bride-to-be of the next MacLeod was to spend the night alone to be, quote, inspected by the fairy ancestors. Notably, upon the group's departure, the MacLeod was presented with a copy of the 1899 illustrated guidebook by RSAI Vice President for Ulster, Reverend George Buick, with the unknown Inverness publication, which the described as being in edition deluxe. The MacLeod was visibly appreciative of the gift and kindly accepted it for his own collection, before stating that he was simply a custodian of the numerous relics which they had seen at Dunvegan on behalf of the Scottish people, and that he hoped that others, like the party, would come and see them from other places. After departing from Dunvegan, the group headed to the uninhabited island of North Rònaidh to study the chapel of St. Ronan. On their way, they stopped at the Flannan Islands and the Outer Hebrides, which you can see them disembarking from the Magic and going on to the islands there. And they also stopped in Callernish to view the Stone Circle and at the Broch of Don Carloway and Lewis, where Dr. Robert Monroe, representing the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, gave a brief lecture to the group on the subject. Thankfully, good weather remained in their favor, and they were able to land safely at Rònaidh on the Saturday, as its position in the North Atlantic could make access difficult due to rough seas. Their only hazards, however, landing at Rònaidh were seabirds, with Jane Shackleton recollecting that there were puffins and seabirds on the ledges, but upon the shore, one had to take great care to avoid stepping on the young birds or their nests in the short grass. Likewise, arriving at the ruins of St. Ronan was particularly significant for previous RSAI excursion members, as it was the northernmost early ecclesiastical site in the British Isles, and they had seen only the southernmost site on the Skellig Islands off the coast of County Kerry on their 1897 cruise. To reach the ruins required what Shackleton described as a considerable climb to the top of the hill, with a short descent that brought them into a little chapel of dry stone masonry. Of the site itself, she noted, there is not much to be said. And while certainly it is not as well preserved as some of the other sites on the voyage, 3 pages were dedicated to the site in the guidebook, with extensive passages from the Scottish ecclesiologist T.S. Muir, whose visits to the island in 1857 and 60 partially inspired their stop. Coincidentally enough, Muir shared Shackleton's dismissive sentiments regarding the site, himself noting, quote, of this rude and diminutive building, not much can be said. The poor state of St. Ronan's can largely be attributed to the island only being inhabited by around 5 families for generations who were farmers and sheep herders, with the population rarely ever exceeding over 30. The islanders also had their own distinct culture, which was observed in the 17th century by visitors to the island that remarked upon their kindness and hospitality and strange method of greetings, where one turned to the sun first before looking back upon the other person and then blessing them. However, their kind way of life ceased to exist by the beginning of the 18th century, as travelers also brought rats. And with no natural predators on the island, they decimated the food supply, which would sustain the population. By the time of the 1899 tour, sheep were then the only known inhabitants of the island, as the last resident, a farmer named Donald MacLeod, known as the King of Rònaidh, left the island in 1846. On Monday, the group reached Case Bay in Caithness after spending a leisurely Sunday at Kirkwall in Orkney to visit its church and freely explore in the afternoon. As they arrived in Keys, Jane Shackleton was instantly awed by the ruins of its late 16th or early 17th century castle, which originally belonged to the Earls of Caithness. Taking a photo of the castle from the Magic, she remarked in her journal that the way it perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea made it a particularly prominent object. Once they disembarked in Keys, they were then joined by Mr. James Currister, Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, who traveled up from his home in Orkney to join them as a guide and expositor during their time in Caithness. He was mainly to guide them through 3 of the 80 famous brocks of Caithness, which is a particular circular kind of prehistoric stone tower found throughout the Highlands and Northern Islands of Scotland. The antiquarian's visit was mainly prompted by recent papers by Dr. Joseph Anderson of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and recent excavations in the area by Sir Francis Barry, Baronet, who had located 8 brocks in 10 years, which were situated in a quarter-mile radius between Barry's residence at Keys Castle and the village. The group was to tour 3 brocks, Keys Road Brock, which was the largest, the Keys Brock, and then the Whitegate Brock before meeting Barry back at his estate to view objects found during the excavations. Jane Shackleton recollected the display as being various objects belonging to the Keys Brock, which were then collected into groups by Barry and laid upon the grassy lawn of his castle. These included a stone cup whetstone, stone lamps, groove stone weights, and rubbing stones for grain. After their session with the objects, the party wished Barry farewell, with half of them choosing to take a wagonette to a more distant rock, while the others chose to go back to the harbor to wait before returning to the ship for a dinner party that evening. And really, like, you can see the people clearly sitting, waiting for everyone to come back before getting on the boat. The events of the dinner were reported by Irish and Scottish publications, such as the Irish Times and the John O'Groat Journal, which described a convivial atmosphere with Mr. Currister aboard the Magic, an additional party of gentlemen from Wick, who were treated to refreshments in the splendid dining room on the ship. Mr. Currister was gifted with a copy of the illustrated guidebook as a thank you on behalf of the group, and RSAI Vice President for Ulster, Reverend George Buick, gave a toast to their visitors from Wick and thanked them for their kindness and hospitality in Caithness. The entire day's program was regarded as a splendid success by all, and as the evening ended and the group's guests departed the Magic from small boats, it was happily reported that they heartily gave 3 cheers for Old Ireland to the group standing on the decks of the boat, who merrily replied back, 3 cheers for bonnie Scotland. The group's 8th and final day at sea, before their overnight return journey to Belfast, was spent first at Illinmore and lastly at Giga Island to view the ruins of St. Carmig's Church and St. Catherine's Church before viewing Giga's reputed Ogham Despite its connections to St. Carmig and the church's 13th century ruins and historic gravestones, Illinmore was seemingly chosen as a place of interest as it was as a convenient stop by the organizers on the way to Giga Island. Giga Island had been highly recommended by RSAI honorary fellow Principal Rees, who sought to have the Ogham stone carefully examined by the party. The small island, which was named about as being 6 miles long by 1.5 miles wide, had become a hot topic of conversation among archaeologists due to the purported Ogham stone, which is a form of ancient writing, being seen so near to Ireland. They anchored 4 miles off Giga along the Kintyre coast, and upon reaching the island, Jane Shackleton described their experience as about a mile of walking up a grassy hill by the edge of a stream and some fields before they reached the church ruins and the stone itself. She admits in her journal that the group's sole reason was to see the Ogham stone, which she noted was standing on a knoll near the little church and was said to be the only Ogham in Scotland known at that point. It was decided that a Mr. Williams, a member of the Cambrian Archaeological Society, who is pictured standing beside the stone, would send his reading of it to Rees in Ireland. However, on the subject, Shackleton expressed that Williams did express some hesitancy, despite his promises, as others on the tour, and not just herself, coolly observed afterwards how he was going around and stating that his reading of the Giga Ogam was different than Professor Rees, and would therefore defer to his authority. Considering the subject matter and tiresome conversations at the end of the day, Shackleton simply ends her sea voyage entries with one sentence: "And so I cannot interpret the stone." Members would, however, receive an interpretation some years later, when RSAI President R.A.S. McAllister would suggest the stone's inscription was uniquely Scottish with Pictish influences. The Magic made an overnight voyage to Belfast once leaving Giga Island and enjoyed breakfast upon their arrival back in Donegal Quay. Breakfast that day was to be particularly essential, as there was to be a large garden party planned for attendees as guests of the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Sir James Henderson, at the exhibition hall in the Botanic Gardens. The music was provided by the 4th Battalion of Royal Irish Rifles, and the party hosted numerous society figures in Belfast and members of the Ulster Archaeological Society for the occasion, which served teas and coffees, lemonades, assorted pastries, sandwiches, ices, and fruits, and of course, a claret cup. The day was filled with lively events such as fortune readings for the ladies and ladies' bicycle polo, which was relatively a new sport, and also received with great fanfare, no doubts, after a few cups of claret. And if you have never heard of bicycle polo, I highly encourage you to go on YouTube and see this clip from the 1930s of this game being played in Dublin's Phoenix Park between a team from Dublin and London. It's absolutely brilliant to watch. So I'll leave that there. If you're bored, it's very fun, very amusing. But more formal events than bicycle polo included thank yous and presentations of a silver cup and silver salver, respectively given to RSAI Honorable General Secretary Robert Cochrane and the Honorable Secretary for Ulster of the Ulster Society of Antiquaries, Mr. Seton Milligan, for their roles in organizing and financing the voyage aboard the steamship Magic. Likewise, the Lord Mayor was presented with a copy of the illustrated guidebook, which was described for its quality by local publications such as the Belfast Newsletter, who noted of its entirely Irish production, from the printing press at Trinity and its use of specially toned art papers to the binding in Belfast made with Irish linen that was then tooled with gilded interlacing Celtic patternwork. The gift was graciously and acceptably received by the Lord Mayor at the gathering of antiquarians, archaeologists, and local figures at an event which was recognized in the society pages as being large, brilliant, and representative. Likewise, the garden party resulted in multiple press reports, such as those seen here, suggesting the broader popularity for the event and its historical and academic endeavors, as a lengthy synopsis of the tour is often provided with accounts of the garden party after the groups returned to Ireland. However, unlike this talk, which will be ending soon, the attendees of the 1899 Scottish Archaeological Tour continued their travels for another 2 full days. The first was spent in Ulster, where they were to explore Portrush, Dunluce Castle, and Giant's Causeway by train, and the second and final day included a stop at Dunluce in County Antrim before reaching Drogheda, where they finished with notable or recently conserved sites in counties Louth and Meath, such as Monaster Boyce, Mellifont Abbey, Newgrange, and the Boyne Valley. And as we figuratively disembark from this magic voyage ourselves, it's important to recognize how overlooked or understudied objects and collections, such as this 1899 illustrated guidebook, can provide fascinating new avenues of discovery, especially when supported by physical and online library and archival sources. While I have just presented only one way of interpretation here, of which there are endless ways, there are also similar volumes that are held in the HES archives and library that could easily support new interdisciplinary projects or readings relating to Scotland's built heritage and archaeological practices. Similar to the ways in which these early antiquarians engaged with and documented the monuments and sites around them, it is worthwhile to reconsider how we continue to engage with our archival materials, resources, and collections in this capacity to enrich our understanding and appreciation of sites, objects, and monuments. In recognizing the significance of the first Celtic gathering of its kind and the foundational work undertaken by its early Scottish, Irish, and Welsh antiquarians, I hope that this talk can likewise facilitate exploration of archival collections and encourage further discourse and collaborations relating to the objects, monuments, and properties in the care of Historic Environment Scotland. And with that, thank you very much.